During his reign, the pharaoh Akhenaten was able to abolish the complex pantheon of the ancient Egyptian religion and replace it with a single god, Aten, who had no image or form. Focusing on the obvious similarities between the religious vision of Akhenaten and the teachings of Moses, Sigmund Freud was the first to argue that Moses was in fact an Egyptian. Researcher Ahmed Osman takes it one step further and contends that Moses of the Bible is no other than King Akhenaten himself, who ruled Egypt for 17 years in the mid-14th century BCE. When modern archaeologists came across the strange figure of Akhenaten in the ruins of Tel el Amarna in the middle of the 19th century, they were not sure what to make of him. Some thought he was a woman disguised as a king. By the early years of the 20th century, when the city of Amarna had been excavated and more became known about him and his family, Akhenaten became a focus of interest for Egyptologists, who saw him as a visionary humanitarian as well as the first monotheist. Sigmund Freud, father of psychoanalysis, was the first to suggest a connection between Moses and Akhenaten. In his last book, Moses and Monotheism, published in 1939, Freud argued that biblical Moses was an official in the court of Akhenaten and an adherent of the Aten religion. After the death of Akhenaten, Freud's theory goes, Moses selected the Israelite tribe living east of the Nile Delta to be his chosen people, took them out of Egypt at the time of the Exodus, and passed on to them the tenets of Akhenaten's religion. Ahmed Osman's pursuit of Freud's theory led him to the conclusion that Moses was Akhenaten himself, son of Amenhotep III and Queen Tai. The queen was the daughter of Amenhotep's minister, Yuya, whom Osman identified as Joseph the Patriarch. Essentially, Akhenaten had an Egyptian father and an Israelite mother. On coming to the throne, Amenhotep III married his sister, Sitamun, who was just a child of 3 years at the time, according to Egyptian customs. However, in his year 2, Amenhotep decided to marry Tai, the girl whom he loved, and made her, rather than Sitamun, his great royal wife, or queen. As a wedding present, Amenhotep presented Tai with the frontier fortress of Zar, in the area of modern Kantara in North Sinai, the capital of the land of Goshen, mentioned by the Bible as the area where the Israelites dwell in Egypt, where he built a summer palace for her. According to Egyptian customs, the king could marry as many women as he desired. However, the queen whose children will follow him on the throne must be his sister, the heiress. Akhenaten was born in year 12 of his father Amenhotep III, 1394 BCE. In the summer royal palace of Zar in northern Sinai, the location where Moses was born. Osman argues, contrary to the biblical account, Moses was born inside the royal palace. Queen Tai had an elder son, Thutmose, who died a short time before Akhenaten's birth. Thutmose had been educated and trained at the royal residence in Memphis before he mysteriously disappeared, believed to have been kidnapped and assassinated by the Amun priest. Fearing for Akhenaten's safety, his mother Tai sent him by water to the safekeeping of her father's Israelite family outside the walls of Zar, which was the origin of the baby in the bulrushes story. The reason for the priest's hostility to the young prince was the fact that Tai, his mother, was not the legitimate heiress to the throne. She couldn't therefore be accepted as a consort for the state god Amun. If Tai's son ascended to the throne, this would be regarded as forming a new dynasty of non-Ammonite kings over Egypt. During his early years, his mother kept Akhenaten away from both royal residences at Memphis and Thebes. He spent his childhood at the border city of Zar, nursed by the wife of the queen's younger brother, General Ai. Later, Akhenaten was moved to Heliopolis, north of Cairo, to receive his education under the supervision of Anen, the priest of Ra, who was the elder brother of Queen Tai. Young Akhenaten appeared at the capital city of Thebes for the first time when he reached the age of 16. There he met with Nefertiti, his half-sister, daughter of Sitamun, for the first time, and fell in love with her. Tai, his mother, encouraged this relationship, realizing that his marriage to Nefertiti the heiress was the only way he could gain the right to follow his father on the throne. Following his marriage to Nefertiti, Amenhotep decided to make Akhenaten his co-regent, which upset the priest of Amun. The conflict between Amenhotep and the priest had started 16 years earlier as a result of his marriage to Tai, daughter of Yuya and Tuya. On his accession to the throne as co-regent, Akhenaten took the name of Amenhotep IV. At Thebes, during the early years of his co-regency, Nefertiti was active in supporting her husband and more prominent than Akhenaten in official occasions as well as on all monuments. However, the climate of hostility that surrounded Akhenaten at the time of his birth surfaced again after his appointment as co-regent. The Amun priesthood opposed this appointment and openly challenged Amenhotep III's decision. When the Amun priest objected to his appointment, Akhenaten responded by building temples to his new god, Aten. He built 3 temples for Aten, one at the back end of the Karnak complex, one at Luxor near the Nile bank, and the third at Memphis. Akhenaten snubbed the Amun priests by not inviting them to any of the festivities in the early part of his co-regency, and in the 4th year, when he celebrated his said festival jubilee, he banned all deities but his own god from the occasion. 12 months later, he made a further break with tradition by changing his name to Akhenaten in honor of his new deity. To the resentful Egyptian establishment, Aten was seen as a challenger who would replace the powerful state god Amun and not come under his domination. In the tense climate that prevailed, Tai arranged a compromise by persuading her son to leave Thebes and establish a new capital at Amarna in Middle Egypt on the east bank of the Nile, some 200 miles to the north of Thebes. The situation calmed down following Akhenaten's departure while Amenhotep ruled alone in Thebes. For building his new city at Amarna, Akhenaten chose a land that belonged to no god or goddess. The building started in his year 4 and ended in year 8. However, he and his family moved from Thebes to Amarna in year 6. Here, Akhenaten built his new capital, Akhenaten, the horizon of Aten, where he and his followers could be free to worship their god. Huge boundary stelae, marking the limits of the city and recording the story of its foundation, were carved into the surrounding cliffs. Akhenaten was a capital city possessed of both dignity and architectural harmony. Its main streets ran parallel to the Nile, with the most important of them, the King's Way, connecting the city's most prominent buildings, including the king's house where Akhenaten and his family lived their private family life. To the south of the house was the king's private temple to Aten, the Great Temple of Aten. A huge building constructed on an east-west axis lay less than a quarter of a mile to the north along the King's Way. Aten was represented by a disc at the top of royal scenes extending its rays towards the king and queen. The rays end in their hands where they are holding an ankh, the Egyptian cross symbol of eternal life. Akhenaten conceived of a single controlling intelligence behind and above all things, including the gods. The king and queen were the major figures in the cult of Aten, whose festivals they celebrated with the local people, with music, chanting, offering of fruits and flowers, and rituals in the open air. Following the death of his father, Amenhotep III, Akhenaten organized a great celebration in his year 12 for foreign princes bearing tribute because of his assumption of sole rule. It was then that the king decided to abolish the worship of all gods in Egypt except Aten. Akhenaten gave orders to his troops instructing them to close all the temples, confiscate its estates, and sack the priest, leaving only Aten's temples throughout the country. Units were dispatched to excise the names of the ancient gods wherever they were found written or engraved, a course that can only have created mounting new opposition to his already rejected authority. This persecution, which entailed the closing of the temples, confiscating its property, the dispatch of artisans who entered everywhere to hack out the names of the deities from inscriptions, the banishment of the clergy, the excommunication of Amun's name, was supervised by the army. Each time a squad of workmen entered a temple or tomb to destroy the name of Amun, it was supported by a squad of soldiers who came to see that the royal decree was carried out without opposition. The persecution of the old gods, however, proved to be hateful to the majority of Egyptians, including members of the army. Ultimately, the harshness of the persecution had a certain reaction upon the soldiers who themselves had been raised in the old beliefs. After all, the officers and soldiers themselves believed in the same gods whose images the king ordered them to destroy. They worshipped in the very temples which they were ordered to close. A conflict arose between the king and his army. Akhenaten's belief in one god, however, was too deep for him to allow any compromise with the priest. Horemheb, Pa-Ramses, and Seti planned a military coup against the king and ordered their troops from the north and south to move towards Akhenaten's location. Commander I, who received news of the troops' movements, brought his chariots to guard Amarna. When the army and chariots came face to face at Amarna's borders, I advised the king to abdicate the throne to his son Tut-Akhenaten in order to save the dynasty. Akhenaten agreed to abdicate and left Amarna with a few of his followers to live in exile in southern Sinai. On hearing about Horemheb's death, Akhenaten decided to leave his exile in Sinai and come back to Egypt in order to reclaim his throne. Since his abdication, he had been living in exile in southern Sinai with a few of his followers for about 25 years during the reigns of Tutankhamun, I, and Horemheb. Here Akhenaten lived among the Sashu Bedouins with whom he formed an alliance. In his rough Bedouin clothes, Akhenaten arrived at Pa-Ramses' residence in the border city of Zar, his birthplace that had turned to a prison for his followers. General Pa-Ramses, by now an old man, was planning for his coronation and getting ready to become the first ruler of a new 19th dynasty when he was informed of Akhenaten's arrival. Akhenaten challenged Pa-Ramses' right to the throne. The general, taken by surprise, decided to call a meeting of the wise men of Egypt to decide between them. At the gathering, Akhenaten produced his scepter of royal power, which he had taken with him to exile, and performed some secret rituals which only the king had the knowledge of. Once they saw the scepter of royal authority and Akhenaten's performance of the rituals, the wise men knelt in adoration in front of him and declared him to be the legitimate king of Egypt. Ramses, however, who was in control of the army, refused to accept the wise men's verdict and decided to establish his rule by force. When Akhenaten realized that his life was threatened by Ramses, he escaped from Zar with some of his followers during the night and rejoined his allies in the Sinai. However, he refused to accept defeat and decided to carry on challenging Ramses' right to rule Egypt. Akhenaten gathered his allies in Sinai and decided to cross the borders of Egypt into Canaan, where he could establish his rule in foreign parts of the Egyptian empire in order to prepare an army to allow him to return and challenge Ramses. When Ramses got knowledge of Akhenaten's plan, he decided to go out with his army and crush the Bedouin power before they crossed the borders of Canaan. Ramses, however, died at this moment and was followed by his son Seti I. Seti left the body of his father for the priests to mummify and went out to chase Akhenaten and his followers in northern Sinai. A military confrontation took place in the very first days of Seti I, on the route between Zar and Gaza in Canaan. Just across the Egyptian border, he arrived at the fortified town of Gaza and stopped Akhenaten from entering it. Seti met Akhenaten in a face-to-face battle on top of a mountain and was able to damage his eye before he killed him and left his body unburied on the mount. This confrontation, which resulted in Akhenaten's death, later became part of a new version of the Osiris-Horus myth, where a confrontation took place between Horus and Set. Although the myth says that Horus won the battle, it was Set who killed Horus. Osman's positions are in conflict with both secular and biblical scholarship. Mainstream Egyptologists, both Egyptian and Western, do not believe Osman's theories are even worth refuting. Suffice it to say, most scholars definitely do not share Osman's view that Akhenaten was really Moses. Nevertheless, the idea of Akhenaten as the pioneer of a monotheistic religion that later became Judaism has been considered by various scholars. It is widely accepted that there are strong stylistic similarities between Akhenaten's great hymn to the Aten and the biblical Psalm 104, though this form is found widespread in ancient Near Eastern hymnology both before and after the period. Others have likened some aspects of Akhenaten's relationship with the Aten to the relationship in Christian tradition of Jesus Christ with God, particularly in interpretations that emphasize a more monotheistic interpretation of Atenism rather than henotheistic. Some have viewed Akhenaten as a harbinger of Jesus. Quote, "After all, Akhenaten did call himself the Son of the sole God, thine only Son that came forth from thy body." James Henry Breasted likened him to Jesus. Arthur Weigel saw him as a fell precursor of Christ, and Thomas Mann saw him, quote, "as right on the way, and yet not the right one for the way," end quote. But Canadian Egyptologist Donald Bruce Redford argues that Akhenaten's monotheism and Judaism are unrelated. He states, quote, "Before much of the archaeological evidence from Thebes and from Tel el Amarna became available, wishful thinking sometimes turned Akhenaten into a humane teacher of the true God, a mentor of Moses, a Christ-like figure, a philosopher before his time. But these imaginary creatures are now fading away as the historical reality gradually emerges. There is little or no evidence to support the notion that Akhenaten was a progenitor of the full-blown monotheism that we find in the Bible. The monotheism of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament had its own separate development, one that began more than half a millennium after the pharaoh's death." End quote. Of course, the archive finds it no big surprise that Redford would uphold and defend the current mainstream historical paradigm. And the archive is not necessarily going down the rabbit hole with Osman's theory either. But we do believe some things are rather obvious. Akhenaten was a historical figure recorded in the annals of the ancient Egyptians. Akhenaten declared the existence of only one god, the Aten, and Akhenaten declared himself the son of the one heavenly Father. The archive also believes it's plausible that if Moses did exist, he was likely Egyptian. And although some biblical scholars have put Moses' birth in the 16th century BCE, there is no definitive time period of his existence. Therefore, it is equally valid to contend that if Moses were in fact a real person, he could have lived during the same time as Akhenaten, or even in a time shortly thereafter. At the very least, this potential historical paradigm opens the door to the possibility that Akhenaten's first form of monotheism did indeed influence Moses in some form or fashion.